Welcome. We are embarking on an intensive exploration of Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, a man known to the world, of course, through his pen name, Lewis Carroll.
And the challenge, and really the fascination, is that Dodgson was a living contradiction.
He absolutely was.
Precisely. We are looking at the architect of worlds defined by this uh, fluid, brilliant nonsense.
Right.
Yet at the same time, he was a man anchored firmly in the rigorous, unyielding reality of Victorian academia. His life was mapped out in logical squares, much like Alice's movement across the chessboard, yet his legacy is pure literary fantasy.
We're pulling together a stack of material diaries, mathematical treatises, critical biographies, and historical research to try and understand the man who wrote the most famous children's books in English. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. Dodgson wasn't just a writer.
Not even close.
He was a serious mathematician, a logician, an inventor, and a really complex photographic artist. Our mission here is to synthesize these competing identities, the logic of Charles Dodgson and the sheer fantasy of Lewis Carroll, and explore the persistent controversies that still make him one of history's most enigmatic figures.
What's fascinating here is just the sheer breadth of his occupations. He was an author, poet, mathematician, photographer, teacher, and an Anglican deacon, albeit a reluctant
A
one.
very reluctant one, it seems.
The paradox is that one persona worked to define and regulate the world, while the other worked just as hard to dismantle it entirely. We need to see how that mathematical brain actually fueled the creativity and maybe vice versa.
We really have to begin with the environment that manufactured the man, his early life. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson was born on the 27th of January, 1832, in Daresbury, Cheshire.
And he was the oldest boy and the third oldest of an astonishing 11 children.
11. Just imagine the domestic chaos contained within that highly conservative, high church Anglican household.
The family history is absolutely crucial because it established the expectations he would later, struggle against.
Right?
They were predominantly Northern English gentry, deeply conservative. If you trace the male line, you find army officers and, overwhelmingly, Anglican clergy. It was a life sort of predetermined by dogma and duty.
And his own father, also named Charles Dodgson, was the immediate example of this duality. The elder Dodgson was a deeply conservative, high church figure who admired the Tractarian movement. Yet, he was a brilliant scholar, mathematically gifted enough to earn a rare double first degree at Oxford.
Which should have set him up for life in academia.
It should have propelled him to academic stardom, but he rejected it for the cloth. He became a country parson and later the Archdeacon of Richmond.
And that decision rejecting secular academic glory for religious duty, that placed an immense burden of expectation on young Charles.
You can feel it, can't you?
You can. And to fully grasp this, we have to understand the environment. The Tractarian movement, which influenced his father, sought to revive these medieval high church traditions within the Church of England. It emphasized ritual, continuity with the ancient church, and the authority of the priesthood.
So a very rigid world.
Extremely. This was an era of intense religious fervor and rigidity, and that formed the intellectual air Dodgson breathed from birth.
And young Charles showed early intellectual promise, which was fostered at home initially.
Oh, absolutely. His reading lists are a testament to a truly precocious mind. We have records showing him reading monumental and complex religious works like John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress before he was even 8 years old.
Wow.
He was intellectually sprinting while his peers were still toddling.
But this intellectual gift was constantly challenged by physical and social difficulties that plagued him throughout his life.
Yes, a childhood fever left him permanently deaf in one ear. Then, at 17, a severe attack of whooping cough seems to have permanently damaged his lungs.
Leaving him with a chronically weak chest.
A chronically weak chest and recurring respiratory issues, yes. These physical vulnerabilities likely deepened his sense of being, well, an outsider.
And then there was the famous social difficulty, the stammer, which he referred to simply as his hesitation.
It's important to be really clear about this. The stammer was a very real, complex condition, and it was shared by most of his siblings.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. It certainly caused him anxiety and sometimes inhibited his social life. But you often hear this charming, but almost certainly apocryphal story that he was only fluent when speaking to children and stumbled only with adults.
I've definitely heard that one.
The evidence just doesn't support that claim. Children who knew him often recalled his difficulty speaking. However, it does seem to be true that the anxiety caused by his stammer was far more acute for him personally than it was for the people he was interacting with.
Which brings us to a perfect piece of biographical myth-making, the Dodo nickname. The widespread theory is that the Dodo in Alice caricatured his difficulty pronouncing his own name, Dudo Dodgson, because of the stammer.
It's a very compelling piece of literary analysis, but fundamentally it remains speculation. He did refer to himself as the Dodo, but the precise reasons are lost to us. We have to appreciate these biographical nuggets for their symbolic power, the logician reduced to an awkward, flightless bird, but also recognize they aren't documented fact.
His formal education, which was supposed to refine him, started poorly. He was sent to rugby school in 1846. He was, by all accounts, miserable there.
Oh, his time at rugby was horrific. He wrote years later that no earthly considerations would induce me to go through my 3 years again.
That's a strong statement.
It is, and he highlighted the systemic brutality, noting particularly that the younger boys were the main targets of older bullies. This sensitivity to cruelty and injustice, developed so early, is a theme we see reflected in the often harsh moral landscape of Wonderland.
Yet, even amidst this unhappiness, his mathematical genius shone through immediately. His mathematics master proclaimed him a more promising boy than any other. That precision was just ingrained.
It was. We have surviving evidence of his rigorous nature even then. His annotated math textbook, The Tutor's Assistant, is inscribed with a warning that translates to, "This book belongs to Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, hands off."
That's amazing.
That blend of serious academic focus and slightly playful sternness is quintessential Dodgson.
That focus led him to Oxford, matriculating at his father's old college, Christ Church, in 1850. He was awarded a studentship nominated by the famous High Church theologian Canon Edward Pusey, reinforcing the family's religious connections.
But early success was marred by immediate tragedy. He had only been in residence for 2 days in 1851 when he received the devastating news that his mother had died suddenly at 47 from inflammation of the brain.
Oh, that's terrible.
This loss, so early in his transition to independence, must have profoundly impacted him, even though he just buried himself in his studies.
And despite not always being the most consistent student, his innate talent was impossible to suppress. He achieved his academic peak in 1854, obtaining first-class honors in the final honors school of mathematics.
And not just first-class honors, he was at the very top of the list.
Right.
That academic success was the final key. It secured his career. In 1855, he won the Christ Church Mathematical Lectureship, a position that provided him with security and structure for 26 years. He remained a resident scholar at the college until his death in 1898. He bought himself a lifetime of intellectual freedom through mathematical rigor.
And it's that stability, that routine, that's the foundation from which Lewis Carroll emerged.
It is genuinely remarkable, isn't it, that a man who anchored his professional life in the strictest institution of mathematics could then launch a worldwide career based on pure, delightful fantasy.
And he'd been writing for a while. Poetry and stories from childhood, contributing to his family magazine, Mishmash.
And he was very critical of his own early work, a perfectionist. Even in 1855, he noted in his diary that he didn't think he had written anything worthy of real publication yet, though he was determined to improve.
So he had standards, even for his creative work.
That shows his dedication to craft. He treated his creative writing with the same serious judgment he applied to his math papers.
The moment of divergence, the official separation, occurred in March 1856 when he published a romantic poem called Solitude in a magazine called The Train. This was the first time he used the name Lewis Carroll.
And the creation of the pseudonym is the perfect piece of intellectual construction. It's a pure logic puzzle.
Explain that.
He took his given names, Charles Lutwidge. He performed a double translation, first to Latin, which gives you Carolus Ludovicus. Then he translated that back to English, but in a different order, which gives you Carroll Lewis. And finally, he just reversed them to create Lewis Carroll.
That is stunning. It's not a random invention. It's a systematic, cryptographic construction.
It emphasizes the absolute control he wanted over his identity. And it was chosen by the editor, Edmund Yates, from a list of 4 options Dodgson provided. So it was a conscious, deliberate effort to separate the serious academic, Dodgson, from the imaginative author, Carroll.
The genesis of the Alice books then hinges on a change in his environment, the arrival of Dean Henry Liddell and his family at Christ Church in 1856. Dodgson, a keen amateur photographer by this point, quickly befriended the family.
Particularly the 3 younger sisters, Lorena, Edith, and of course, Alice Liddell.
Right.
And he often took the children on excursions, including those famous rowing trips up the Isis River. We have to note, though, he was exceptionally cautious about these outings. always ensuring he was accompanied by an adult friend to avoid any hint of impropriety.
Which speaks again to his meticulous nature and awareness of social codes.
Always.
The creation story is one of literature's most beloved moments. It happened on the 4th of July, 1862.
Yes. On a sweltering summer afternoon during a rowing trip to Godstow. To amuse the children, Dodgson began inventing a story, improvising the outline of the tale on the spot for Alice Liddell. She was so captivated she begged him instantly, "Mr. Dodgson, you must write it out for me."
And that initial request led to the manuscript Alice's Adventures Underground, which he painstakingly wrote out and even illustrated for her. He finally presented it in late 1864.
But the push for publication came from outside. George MacDonald, the Scottish writer, and his children read the incomplete manuscript and were so enthusiastic that they encouraged Dodgson to seek a publisher.
So he needed that external validation.
It seemed so. That outside affirmation was vital for a man who, I think, often doubted his own creative merit.
After considering titles like Alice Among the Fairies, he published it in 1865 as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, featuring Sir John Tenniel's iconic illustrations. And the commercial success was, well, it was instant and colossal.
Yeah. It exploded. It defined Victorian literary nonsense and brought fame and immense correspondence to Lewis Carroll. This fame was often burdensome for the fiercely private Dodgson, who struggled to reconcile his desire for privacy with his sudden status as a celebrity author.
We have to pause on his denial. He consistently insisted that his literary heroine was not based on any single real child.
This is where the paradox just deepens, isn't it? While Alice Liddell was the clear catalyst, and we know the acrostic poem at the end of Through the Looking Glass spells out her full name, Dodgson maintained the heroine was a composite, a fictional creation.
So what's that about?
Well, if you look at it through the lens of a logician, wasn't that denial a piece of calculated nonsense in itself? A deliberate act of protecting the real Alice by hiding the truth in a well-constructed lie, allowing the creative work to stand alone.
That separation of identities leads directly to that fantastic Queen Victoria myth, the story that she enjoyed Alice so much she asked him to dedicate his next book to her.
Only to receive the dense mathematical volume, a elementary treatise on determinants.
It's a great story.
It's a hilarious image, but one Dodgson strongly and repeatedly repudiated. He called the story utterly false in every particular. It would have been a profound betrayal of his personal rules. He maintained absolute segregation between the author of Alice and the author of mathematics.
But the myth's existence shows how much the public wanted those two personas to collide.
Exactly.
5 years later, the sequel, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, was published in 1871. And there's a general scholarly consensus that its tone is slightly darker than Wonderland.
Many scholars connect that darker undertone to a period of intense personal reflection and grief. His beloved father died in 1868, a tragedy followed by a profound depressive episode for Dodgson. The shift in tone from the energetic chaos of Wonderland to the ordered yet melancholy world of the chessboard might well reflect his internal state during that period.
Beyond Alice, his other great literary success was The Hunting of the Snark in 1876.
This poem is perhaps his purest expression of philosophical nonsense. It chronicles the absurd journey of a crew searching for the mythical snark, only to discover the boojum. Critics were initially bewildered, but the public adored its ambiguity. It was reprinted 17 times by 1908.
It's so open to interpretation. I read that the pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti was convinced the entire poem was an elaborate satire aimed directly at him.
That's the story, yes. And that capacity for being all things to all readers is the essence of his nonsense. His final major effort, however, didn't quite match that brilliance. The two-volume Sylvie and Bruno.
Published in 1889 and 1893.
It was an ambitious comeback attempt, weaving together plots in rural England and the fictional kingdoms of Elfland and Outland. He used it as a vehicle to satirize various aspects of English society and the academic establishment he lived in. But while it was still published, it just lacked the focus and spontaneous energy of the Alice books. It's generally regarded as his lesser literary work.
Now we have to step back across the boundary, back to the world of Charles Dodgson, the academic. This was his livelihood, his security, and his constant pursuit of verifiable truth. For 26 years, he was the Christ Church mathematical lecturer.
And his contributions were far from trivial. He produced nearly a dozen books under his real name, tackling serious fields: geometry, linear and matrix algebra, mathematical logic, and recreational mathematics.
It's this rigorous analytical mind that the world often forgets when they think of the Mad Hatter.
Completely.
Let's focus on mathematical logic for a moment, an area that has seen a significant resurgence in appreciation for Dodgson's originality.
Absolutely. His work, particularly his final posthumously published work, Symbolic Logic Part 2, is groundbreaking. In it, he introduced a graphical method for assessing the validity of syllogisms, which he called method of trees.
The method of trees, what does that actually mean?
Well, modern logicians recognize this as the earliest use of what we now call a truth tree, a foundational tool in contemporary mathematical logic. He was decades ahead of his time in formalizing logical proofs in a visual, graphical way.
So he was applying the same structural thinking that built the narrative framework of Wonderland to the fundamentals of logical truth.
Exactly. He was formalizing structure, and his algebraic contributions also endure. He developed a method for evaluating determinants known as Dodgson condensation.
That sounds very technical.
It is, but it's a brilliant recursive method for reducing a complex matrix evaluation to simpler terms. This work, investigated much later by Robbins and Rumsey, actually led directly to the famous alternating sign matrix conjecture, now a proven theorem in combinatorial mathematics. His obscure Victorian calculations paved the way for modern combinatorial proofs.
Beyond pure mathematics, he applied this precision to the real world, most surprisingly in civics and voting theory.
Which is fascinating for a sheltered Oxford don, isn't it? He proposed Dodgson's method, which is a variant of the Condorcet method. The goal is to find the candidate who would require the fewest theoretical preference changes from voters to become the Condorcet winner. That is, the candidate who defeats every other candidate in a head-to-head comparison.
So a way to find the true consensus choice.
A very sophisticated way, yes. And in 1884, he went even further, proposing a proportional representation system.
This is really visionary.
It is. His system involved multi-member districts, single votes, quotas, and transferable votes. In modern terms, it's an early concept akin to what we now call liquid democracy, where voters can delegate their votes to others. The mind that gave us the Queen of Hearts was also attempting to perfect the mechanism of democratic representation.
This obsession with perfection and regulation spilled over into his everyday life. He was a keen inventor of puzzles and small gadgets aimed at removing inefficiency.
His recreational mathematics is famous. He produced the doublets puzzle in 1878, which you and I know today as the word ladder.
Right, the challenge to link two words by changing only one letter at a time, with every intermediary step being a valid word, like seat to dodge, cat, CRT, DOT, dod.
Exactly. And he published this weekly in Vanity Fair for 2 years. It's another perfect example of his obsession with sequence and minimal movement. If Wonderland is defined by constant, unpredictable transformations, Dodgson's puzzles demand predictable, minimal transformations.
Now for the gadgets. We mentioned the nightograph, which allows note-taking in the dark. How did that meticulous system actually work?
Dodge was constantly plagued by ideas striking him in the middle of the night, forcing him to get up and strike a light, a huge inconvenience in the Victorian era. The nightograph solved this. It was a gridded card that fit inside a pocket case.
Okay.
He devised a system of shorthand, non-Latin symbols, dots, lines, angles that corresponded to letters. By placing the card on paper and filling the grids by touch, he could transcribe complex ideas without sight. He was essentially designing a tactile interface for a pre-electronic age.
And his organizational rigor extended to the most mundane aspects of Victorian life, like mailing letters.
Indeed. He invented the Wonderland postage stamp case in 1889. It was a cloth-backed folder with 12 labeled slots for stamps of different values. He was so specific about its use that he included advice in his accompanying pamphlet, 8 or 9 wise words about letter writing, advising that the case was specifically not meant to be carried in a pocket or purse.
It was a stationary organizer, and he insisted on it.
The level of control this implies is breathtaking. He applied this structural scrutiny to virtually every area he encountered. He devised a rule for finding the day of the week for any date instantly, a system for justifying right margins on a typewriter, even fairer elimination rules for tennis tournaments.
But the most delightfully Dodgsonian invention might be the cardboard scale he designed for the senior common room at Christ Church.
Ah, the liqueur scale. This scale was designed to be held up next to a glass to ensure that the exact correct amount of liqueur was served for the price paid.
That's incredible.
Think about that. The man who wrote philosophical nonsense felt compelled to regulate the volume of brandy served to his colleagues with mathematical precision. That right there is the core of the Wonderland paradox.
We must now examine the visual side of his duality. His 24-year career as a photographer, running from 1856 to 1880, he learned the art from his uncle, Skeffington Lutwidge, and he quickly became proficient.
He was a well-known, respected gentleman photographer, meaning he pursued it as an intense artistic and scientific hobby, not a commercial profession. He really excelled at portraiture.
So why did he stop so abruptly in 1880 after nearly a quarter century?
It was primarily a technological shift that he refused or was maybe unable to keep up with. Dodgson used the wet collodion process.
What did that involve?
This method required the photographer to coat a glass plate with collodion immediately before taking the picture, expose the plate while it was still wet, and then process it instantly, all within about 10 minutes.
So it was a massive effort.
Immense.
Yeah.
It often required a portable darkroom to be carted around on his expeditions. By the late 1870s, commercial photographers were transitioning to the much faster, more practical dry plate process. Dodgson found the wet collodion method too demanding to maintain alongside his teaching and writing.
He produced around 3,000 images in his career, though fewer than 1,000 have survived.
Right. And for his public life, photography was an important tool. It was a social entree. The need for sitters and the scientific interest in the medium allowed him to access the high society he generally shied away from.
He took remarkable portraits of figures like Alfred Tennyson, Michael Faraday, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and the pioneering photographer Julia Margaret Cameron.
He did.
Now we must address the most sensitive area of his artistic output. When we analyze his surviving work, a study shows that just over half of it depicts young girls. And of the surviving collection, 30 photographs depict nude or semi-nude children.
We also have to note a disturbing piece of archival loss. About 60% of his original photographic portfolio was deliberately destroyed, though the reason for this extensive destruction is entirely unspecified in the sources we have.
So how do scholars interpret his interest in child photography within his time? It is essential to look at the Victorian standards of art, not just our modern morality.
Scholars argue very strongly that this practice must be understood within the aesthetics of the Victorian child cult. This artistic and social movement idealized children as expressions of unfallen innocence and purity.
Right.
Within this context, child nudity, especially on artistic representations, was seen as a celebration of innocence, not an obscenity.
So it was a mainstream aesthetic.
Completely mainstream.
Yeah.
Child nudes were often featured on Victorian Christmas cards, which shows how commonplace the aesthetic was. Dodgson was not an outlier. Other prominent Victorian photographers, including Julia Margaret Cameron and Oscar Gustav Rejlander, also took such photographs. To interpret Dodgson's work accurately, we have to situate it within that contemporary artistic framework.
And did he exert control over these images once they were captured?
Absolutely. His logical mind was always curating the narrative. We know he often altered the photographs, blurring backgrounds, or even painting over elements to manipulate the final image. One scholar described this process as Dodgson exerting his agency by literally rewriting the text created by the image to produce a new dialogue about childhood, always meticulous in ensuring the final piece conveyed the precise aesthetic of innocence he intended.
We transition now to the unresolved mysteries that perpetually fuel reassessment of Dodgson's life. The logical, meticulous structure of his biography sort of dissolves into uncertainty here, and we must rely strictly on documented facts and scholarly debates.
Let's start with his unexpected decision regarding his religious life. Dodgson was expected to progress from deacon to priest, a standard condition of residency at Christ Church, having already been ordained a deacon in 1861.
But a year later, he refused the priesthood, fundamentally altering his career trajectory.
This was a massive decision. It put him in direct conflict with the dean, Henry Liddell, who initially threatened expulsion, a move that would have cost Dodgson his lectureship and residency.
But he didn't expel him.
No. For reasons that remain entirely unclear, Liddell reversed his decision literally overnight, permitting Dodgson to remain as a perpetual deacon in defiance of college rules.
What are the competing theories for this refusal, since he never publicly explained it?
There is no single answer. It might have been a final rebellion against his late father's rigid high church expectations. He developed an interest in minority Christian forms that clashed with Anglican orthodoxy.
And the theater.
Yes, perhaps most famously, he held a great interest in the theater, which the Bishop of Oxford strongly opposed as morally detrimental. However, the most compelling evidence comes from his own writings, where he frequently expressed this profound, crippling sense of vile and worthless sin and unworthiness.
So a deep internal religious struggle.
It suggests that, yes, a struggle that convinced him he was simply unfit to serve as a priest.
This internal torment leads us to the archival silence. the missing records.
This is the void that biographers have struggled with for decades. At least 4 complete volumes and approximately 7 individual pages of his 13 diaries are gone. Crucially, the missing material covers the period between 1853 and 1863, his early 20s.
So the most formative years of his personal life, bridging his academic success and his literary creation, are largely undocumented.
Precisely. It is commonly assumed, though not proven, that Dodgson's family members, especially his sisters, removed and destroyed the material after his death to protect the family name and reputation. The man who cataloged stamps was also a victim of a posthumously controlled narrative.
The most famous absence is the missing page of 27 June 1863, the day the relationship with the Liddell family fractured.
Right, and popular speculation ran wild for years, suggesting this page was torn out to conceal an indiscreet, perhaps even scandalous event, like a marriage proposal to the 11-year-old Alice Liddell.
But the picture is far more complicated and probably less dramatic.
It seems so. We have secondary evidence, known as the cut pages in diary document, written by his nephew based on his aunt's recollections. This material suggests the break was not about Alice Liddell at all, but rather due to gossip circulating about Dodgson and the family's governess, or perhaps Alice's older sister, Lorena Liddell.
Which shifts the focus away from Alice entirely.
It does. And furthermore, a 1930 letter from the younger Lorena suggests the mother intervened because Dodgson's manner, while innocent, became too affectionate toward Alice as she matured, causing social discomfort.
This suggests the rift wasn't necessarily a singular, dramatic moral failure, but a complex, emotionally charged social situation common as a girl transitions into young womanhood in that rigid Victorian environment.
Exactly. The need for interpretation created a shifting biographical landscape. The speculation regarding his interest in children has evolved dramatically over time, influenced heavily by cultural norms.
The major shift seems to have begun in the mid-20th century.
That's when biographers began applying Freudian psychoanalytic theory, which was gaining prominence in the 1930s. Biographers in the 1940s and later, like Morton Cohen, began to speculate that his aesthetic interest in children concealed an erotic element.
Right.
They suggested his assertion of pure aesthetic interest was naive, arguing that his sexual energies sought unconventional outlets. This psychoanalytic interpretation cast him as emotionally arrested or a repressed pedophile, a perception heavily influenced by the cultural anxieties of that time.
But the narrative of the repressed academic did not stick universally. Carolyn Leach mounted the famous Carroll myth counter-argument.
Leach challenged the entire premise. She argued that the psychoanalytic biographers profoundly misunderstood Victorian social customs regarding friendship and innocence. She pointed out that the initial biographies created a false image of an emotionally stunted man who had no interest in adult women.
And she found evidence to the contrary.
Ample evidence. Her research showed evidence in his diaries of significant enjoyable relationships with married and single adult women. She noted that many of his so-called child friends were actually in their late teens and 20s, but were addressed as children because of Victorian social nomenclature.
This suggests that his well-meaning family, by destroying evidence of his adult relationships to preserve a sanitized, innocent image, inadvertently created the exact vacuum that later allowed the psychoanalytic theories to flourish.
It's a tragic irony. The struggle to preserve his reputation ultimately led to its greatest stain. The complexity of this was brought into the spotlight dramatically by the 2015 BBC documentary, The Secret World of Lewis Carroll.
That documentary attempted to critically examine his relationship with Alice and reignited the debate about improper conduct causing the Liddell rift.
And its handling of evidence was highly problematic. The second part of the documentary featured a supposedly disturbing, full-frontal nude photograph of Alice's adolescent sister, Lorena, suggesting it might be Dodgson's.
And the speculation was based on an ambiguous L. Carroll attribution on the back.
Scrawled in pencil by an unknown hand. The reaction from expert Carroll scholars was immediate and fierce. Leading scholars, including Jenny Wolfe and Edward Wakeling, immediately questioned the photo's authenticity. They pointed out that the image lacked Dodgson's meticulous catalog number, a glaring omission for a man obsessed with documentation.
That's a huge red flag.
It is. Wakeling definitively stated that Dodgson never made full-frontal studies, particularly a girl as mature as this, and that the Liddells would never have consented to it.
And the BBC's handling of this specific, highly sensitive piece of evidence led to official intervention.
It did. The BBC Trust ultimately ruled that the documentary could not be reshown in its current form. The trust found the BBC failed to adhere to ethical guidelines, specifically by not informing participants about the photo's inclusion during filming or giving them adequate time to react.
It's a stark modern example of the danger of interpreting these serious historical matters through a sensationalizing modern lens.
Confusing the aesthetics of the 19th century with the morality of the 21st.
Finally, Dodgson has a unique, though perhaps tenuous, connection to medical history via his fiction. He accurately documented his first migraine with aura in 1880, describing the visual disturbances as shifting, structured patterns he called moving fortifications.
And that leads to the naming of the specific migraine aura known as Alice in Wonderland syndrome, AIWS. This syndrome causes temporary disturbances in visual perception, often involving micropsia or macropsia, making objects appear drastically smaller or larger than they are, mirroring Alice's fluctuating size.
A neat connection.
It is, but there is no evidence Dodgson himself suffered this specific type of aura, though he did suffer severe migraines and experience epileptiform seizures involving full loss of consciousness that left him disoriented.
So we're left with an undeniable legacy, one that reaches far beyond the literary impact of Wonderland. The logical mind of Charles Dodgson continues to be felt in highly technical fields.
His contributions to symbolic logic, the method of trees, his algebraic work leading to the alternating sign matrix conjecture, and his pioneering work in voting theory are still studied and recognized for their rigor and foresight.
He's not just a literary figure.
No, he is a permanent, if often overlooked, fixture in the history of mathematics.
His lasting place in the cultural memory is symbolized by his commemoration in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in 1982, and his connection to Oxford remains strong.
Yes. Just recently, in 2025, a massive private collection of Lewis Carroll artifacts, thousands of items including letters, photographs, illustrations, and books, was donated to Christ Church.
Wow.
It ensures that the legacy of both Charles Dodgson and Lewis Carroll remains physically present at the institution that housed his contradictions for so long.
So we return to the core synthesis of this figure. He was an individual who spent his life applying mathematical and logical rigor to absolutely everything, from formal treatises on determinants to regulating the amount of liqueur poured in the common room.
Yet this same precision machine channeled its creative output into philosophical nonsense, crafting worlds that defy every single rule the man himself lived by. He constructed chaos with the meticulousness of an architect.
We've discussed the missing pages of his diary that fuel so much conjecture about the man he really was. Consider this final question. Given his talent for wordplay and veiled meanings, how much of the literary nonsense that captivated the world of Wonderland, was actually a highly sophisticated, coded attempt to resolve the religious, social, and deeply personal contradictions he simply couldn't face directly in his role as the conservative Oxford Don? Was Wonderland his true diary?
The irony's rich, isn't it? The most structured, rule-bound man in Oxford found his only true voice and freedom in the calculated chaos of his imagination.
Thanks for listening.